Chapter 1. After the death of Achab, Moab revolted from Israel. And Ahaziah lay sick at that time in his chamber at Shomeron, and was anxious. So he sent messengers to go and inquire from Baal-zebub, the god of Akron, "If I can revive from this illness?" But a messenger of the ever-living commanded Elia the Tishbite, "Arise, go up to meet the ambassadors of the king of Shomeron, and say to them, Is it because there is not a God in Israel that you go to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Akron? Consequently, thus says the ever-living, From the bed that you are upon you shall not arise, for you shall die." Then Elia departed. When the messengers returned to him, he asked them, "Why have you returned?" They answered him, "A man came up to meet us and said, 'Go, return to the king who sent you, and say to him, Thus asks the ever-living, Was it because there is no God in Israel that you sent to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Akron? Therefore from the bed you lie upon you shall not arise, for you shall die.'" Then he asked them, "What kind of a man was he who came up to meet you, and said these things to you?" And they replied to him, "A man covered with hair, and belted with a leather belt round his waist." When he exclaimed, "It is Elia the Tishbite!" He therefore sent to him a captain of his guards, who went up to him where he lived on the top of a hill, and said, "Man of God, the king commands you to come down." But Elia answered and said to the captain of the guards, "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from the skies and devour you and your company." And fire came down from the skies and consumed him and his company. Then again he sent to him another captain of the guards with his company, who spoke and said to him, "Man of God, the king asks you to descend from that hill." But Elia replied and said to them, "If I am a man of God, let fire descend from the skies and consume you and your company." When fire came down upon them from the skies and consumed him and his company. But again he sent a third captain of the guards with his company, and the third went up and arrived, but he knelt on his knees before Elia and showed him respect, and said, "Man of God, let my life and the lives of these servants of yours be precious in your sight. For fire came down from the skies and consumed the two captains and their companies. But now let my life be precious in your eyes." Then the messenger of the ever-living commanded Elia, "Go down with him, fear not for his presence." So he arose and descended with him to the king, and said to him, "Thus asks the ever-living, Why have you sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Akron? Is it because there is no God in Israel to ask for his decision? Therefore, from the bed upon which you are laid, you shall not descend, for you shall die." And he did die, according to the word of Elia. And Jehoram his brother began to reign in his place in the 2nd year of Jehoram ben Jehoshaphat king of Judah, for he had not a son. As for the other things that Ahaziah did, they are written in the history of events of the period of the kings of Israel. Chapter 2. When the ever-living was about to take up Elia in a tempest to the heavens, Elia and Elisha were traveling in Gilgal, and Elias said to Elisha, "Go back now from here, for the ever-living will send me to Bethel." But Elisha replied, "By the life of the ever-living, and by your life, I will not leave you." So they descended to Bethel. When at Bethel, some preachers came to Elisha, and asked him, "Do you know that the ever-living will take your master from your head?" And he replied, "I know it. Be silent." Elia again said to Elisha, "Turn back, I pray, here, for the ever-living has sent me to Jericho." But he replied, "By the life of the ever-living, and by the life of your soul, I will not leave you." So they went on to Jericho, where the preachers who were in Jericho approached to Elisha, and asked him, "Do you know that today the ever-living will take your master from your head?" And he answered, "I also know it. Be silent." Then Elias said to him, "Return, I beg, here, for the ever-living has sent me to the Jordan." But he replied, "By the life of the ever-living and the life of your soul, I will not leave you." So both of them went on, and 50 men from the preachers went and stationed themselves at a distance to the south. But they too stood by the Jordan. And Elia took his mantle, and folded it, and struck the waters, when they divided on this side and that, and both passed over on dry land. When they had passed over, Elia said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before God takes me from you." And Elisha answered, "Let twice your spirit come upon me." When he replied, "You have asked a hard thing. If you see me taken from you, then it will come to you, but if not, it will not come." While they were walking and conversing, a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire, and stopped between them. And Elia ascended in a tempest to the heavens. But Elisha looked on and shouted, My father, the chariot of Israel and its horses!" But he never saw him again. He seized his robe, however, and it tore into two, and the mantle that Elia wore fell upon him. Then he returned and stood on the bank of the Jordan, and took the mantle of Elia, which had fallen from off him, and struck the waters, and said, "Come, ever-living, the God of Elia, as if to himself." Then he struck the waters, and they divided on this side and that, and Elisha crossed over. And the pupils of the preachers who were in Jericho to the south saw it, and remarked, "The spirit of Elia has fallen upon Elisha." So they went to meet him, and bowed to him to the earth, and said, "You see now your servants are 50 strong men. Let us go and seek Elia, for fear the spirit of the ever-living should carry him away, and drive him to some of the hills, or to some of the vales." But he replied, "Do not go." They, however, pressed him until he was ashamed, when he answered, "Go." So the 50 men went and searched for 3 days, but could not find him. They consequently returned to him, for he was staying in Jericho, and he said to them, "Did I not tell you not to go?" The men of the town once said to Elisha, "The position of the town is good, as your lordship perceives, but the water is bad, and the ground barren." He consequently replied, "Fetch me a new bowl, and put salt in it, and bring it me." Then he went to the water springs, and threw the salt into them, and said, "Thus says the ever-living, I have cured these waters. Death and barrenness shall no more come from them." And the waters have been healthy to this day, according to the message Elisha delivered. Once he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was on the road, some young lads met him near the town, and ridiculed him, exclaiming, "Go up, bald head! Go up, bald head!" When he turned and cursed them in the name of the ever-living. And 2 bears from the forest met them, and tore 42 of the lads. From there he went to Mount Carmel, and afterwards he settled in Shomeron. Chapter 3. Jehoram ben Achab began to reign over Israel in Shomeron in the 11th year of Jehoshaphat king of Judah, and he reigned 12 years, and did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living, but not like his father and mother, for he overturned the columns of Baal that his father had made. From the sins, however, of Jeroboam ben Nebat, which he caused Israel to sin, he did not turn away. Mesha the king of Moab was his shepherd, and paid to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs, and 100,000 rams' fleeces. But when Achab died, the king of Moab revolted from the king of Israel. Then King Jehoram at once set out from Shomeron, and organized the forces of Israel, and marched. He also sent to Jehoshaphat king of Judah to say, "Moab has revolted from me. Will you go with me to Moab to fight?" And he answered, "I will go, for mine are yours, and your people are like mine, and my cavalry like your cavalry." He also asked, "By what road shall we advance?" When he replied, "By way of the pastures of Edom." The king of Israel, and the king of Judah, and the king of Edom consequently marched by that route for 7 days, until there was no water for the soldiers or the cattle belonging to them, so that the king of Israel exclaimed, "Alas! Why has the ever-living collected these 3 kings to give them to the hand of Moab?" But Jehoshaphat inquired, "Is there not a preacher of the ever-living here, that we may inquire of the ever-living through him?" Then one of the officers addressed the king of Israel, and said, "Elisha ben Shaphat is here, who poured water on the hands of Elia." And Jehoshaphat added, The word of the ever-living is with him. Therefore the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went to him, when Elisha asked the king of Israel, Why do you come to me? Go to the preachers of your father and the preachers of your mother. But the king of Israel replied, No, for the ever-living has collected these 3 kings to give them to the hand of Moab. When Elisha answered, By the life of the ever-living power, before whose face I stand, but for the presence of Jehoshaphat king of Judah, I would perish rather than attend to you or see you. But, however, bring me a harp. And a harp was brought with a harper. Then the hand of the ever-living came upon him, and he said, Thus says the ever-living, Make trenches in this valley. For thus says the ever-living, No wind shall be perceived, and no rain shall be seen. Yet the valley shall be full of water, and you shall be quenched with your animals and cattle. But that is a trifle in the sight of the ever-living. Therefore he will give Moab into your power, and you shall storm all the fortified cities and all the best towns. And you shall fell all the beautiful woods, and stop up all the springs of water, and cover all their beautiful gardens with stones. When morning came, at the time of offering the gift, a flood had come from the direction of Edom, and covered the country with water. As related, all Moab had heard that the kings had come up to fight with them, and had convoked an armed force, and had advanced, and were stationed near. They also awoke in the morning when the sun shone upon the waters, and the Moabites at a distance saw the waters red like blood. So they exclaimed, That is blood! The kings have been fighting with the sword, and every man has struck his mate. So now, Moab, for the plunder! And they advanced to the camp of Israel. But Israel arose and assailed Moab, and they fled before them, and they attacked and defeated Moab, and destroyed the towns. And over all the beautiful gardens they spread stones, and destroyed them, and filled up the wells of water, and felled all the pleasant trees to extirpate them. They broke down the walled buildings, and tore up their foundations to the bottom. Consequently the king of Moab saw they were stronger than him in war. So he took with himself 700 trained soldiers to break through the king of Edom, but was not able. Then he took his son, the eldest, who would have reigned after him, and offered him as a burnt offering on the top of the wall, for he was furious against Israel. They afterwards retired from him, and returned to their country. Chapter 4. Once a woman, a wife of one of the preachers, appealed to Elisha, saying, Your servant, my husband, has died, and you know that your servant reverenced the ever-living. But a creditor has come to take my 2 sons for his slaves. And Elisha asked her, What can I do for you? Inform me what furniture you have in the house. When she said, There is nothing in the house of your handmaid except a jar of oil. He then answered, Go and borrow vessels from all the inhabitants of the street, barrels of a not small capacity. Then come and shut the door behind you and behind your sons, and pour into all these vessels, and fill them full. She accordingly went from him, and shut the door behind herself and her sons who went with her, and they poured. And when they had filled the vessels, she said to one son, Bring me another cask. But he replied to her, There is not another cask. Then the oil ceased. She therefore went to the man of God and informed him, who said, Go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and support yourself with the remainder. At one period Elisha was traveling to Shunem, where there was a great lady who invited him to eat bread, and whenever he was passing by there, to turn in to take food. The woman also said to her husband, See, now you know that he is a holy man of God who passes by us continually. Let me furnish the little upper chamber, and put a bed there for him, with a table and a chair, so that when he comes to us he may visit here. And he came there that same day, and turned to go up to her to rest himself. He consequently said to Gehazi his attendant, Call this Shunammess. And he called her, and she stood before him. Then he said to him, Say to her, I see how you have cared for us with all this trouble. What can be done for you? Can I speak for you to the king, or to the commander of the army? But she answered, I reside amongst my own people. Then he asked, But what can be done for her? And Gehazi replied, She grieves because she has no son, and her husband is old. Then he said, Call her. And he called her, and she stood in the doorway, when he said, At the return of this season you shall fold a son in your arms. But she exclaimed, No, sir, man of God, do not lie to your handmaid. The woman, however, conceived, and bore a son, when that season came round, as Elisha had said to her. And the lad grew up, and one day went out to his father in the harvest field, and said to his father, My head, my head! So he ordered his attendant to carry him to his mother. He consequently carried him and brought him to his mother, who placed him on her knees until noon, when he died. Then she arose and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and closed the door, and went out and approached her husband, and said, I wish you to send with me one of the servants and one of the riding asses, for I wish to go quickly to the man of God, and to return. But he asked, What is the matter with you, that you would go to him? Today is not a festival, nor a Sabbath. And she answered, Right. Then they saddled the asses, and she said to the servant, Drive, do not hold back for me to ride, for have I not told you to be quick? Thus she went, and came to the man of God on Mount Carmel. And when the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi his attendant, Look, the Shunammite is there. Run now to meet her, and ask her, Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with your lad? But she came to the man of God on the hill, and seized his feet. Gehazi, however, came to remove her, when the man of God said, Remove her not, for her soul is in grief. But the ever-living has hidden it from me, and has not informed me of it. Then she exclaimed, Did I ask a son from my lord? Why did you tell me he should be sent to me? Then he said to Gehazi, Gird up your loins, and take my staff in your hand. If you meet a man, do not address him, and if a man addresses you, do not answer him, and lay my staff upon the face of the child. But the mother of the child said, By the life of the ever-living, and by the life of your soul, I will not part from you. He therefore arose and followed her. But Gehazi pushed on before them, and laid the staff upon the face of the child. But there was neither voice nor utterance. He consequently returned back to meet and inform them, saying, The child has not awakened. Then Elisha came to the house, and saw the child lying as dead upon the bed. So he went in and shut the door behind both of them, and prayed to the ever-living. Then he went up and lay upon the child, and placed his own face to his face, and his own eyes to his eyes, and his own hands to his hands, and bowed over him, and warmed the body of the lad. Then he went away, and walked in the house here and there once, and once again, and again ascended, and bent over him, when the lad sneezed 7 times, and opened his eyes. At which he called Gehazi, and said, Fetch his mother here. When he invited her, and she came, and he said, Take up your son. But she came and fell at his feet, and bowed to the earth, and then took her son, and departed. Elisha afterwards went to Gilgal, and a famine was in the country. So the pupils of the preachers came to him, when he said to his attendant, Set the great pot, and boil pottage for the students of the preachers. And one of them then went to the field to collect vegetables, and found wild vines, and gathered some of them, and wild gourds, filling his bag, and returned and flung the collection into the pot, for he knew not what they were. Then they poured out for the men to eat. But when they would have eaten the bunches, they cried out and said, Man of God, there is death in the pot! And they would not eat. He therefore commanded, and they took flour and threw into the pot. Then he said, Pour out for the people. And they ate, and nothing bad came from the pot. Once a man came from Baal-shalsha, and brought to the man of God, and presented to him from his firstfruits 20 cakes of barley and a sack of garden produce. But he said, Give them to the people, and let them eat. When he asked, What will this be divided to 100 people? He only answered, Give to the people, and let them eat. For thus says the ever-living, They will eat, and there will be leavings. So he put it before them, and they ate, and left part of it, as the ever-living had said. Chapter 5. Naaman was then commander of the army of the king of Aram, a great man in the presence of his prince, and he bore renown, for the ever-living had given success to Aram by him, and the man was a great hero, but a leper. When the troops of the Aramites had invaded the land of Israel, they brought back a little girl, who attended on the wife of Naaman. And she said, "I wish my master were near the preacher who is in Shomeron, for there he could be relieved of his leprosy." She consequently went and reported to her husband, saying, "The girl you brought from the land of Israel says this and that." Then the king of Aram said, "Go, go, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went and took 10 talents of silver with him, and 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 robes of honor, and brought the letter to the king of Israel to say, "When this letter reaches you, you will see I send my officer Naaman to you, that you may relieve him of his leprosy." But when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes, and exclaimed, "Am I God, able to kill and revive, that this man should send to me to relieve that man from his leprosy? Who will study it now, and ascertain how he would pick a quarrel with me?" But when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent to the king to ask, "Why have you torn your robes? Come, however, to me, and I will teach you that there is a preacher in Israel." Naaman accordingly came with his horses and chariots, and stood before the house of Elisha. But Elisha only sent a messenger to him to say, "Go, and wash 7 times in Jordan, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and be clean." Naaman, however, became furious, and went away, and exclaimed, "Look, I said to myself, he will come out and stand up and call upon the name of his ever-living God, and wave his hand over the place, and remove the leprosy. Are not beautiful Abana and Parphar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the brooks of Israel? Could I not wash in them, and cleanse myself?" So he turned and went away in a rage. But his officers approached him and said, "Sir, if the preacher had commanded you to do a great thing, would you not have done it? Then why not when he says to you, 'Wash and become clean'?" He consequently went down to the Jordan, and bathed in it 7 times, as the man of God commanded, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was cleansed. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his staff, and entered and stood before him, and said, "Look, now I have learnt that there is no God in all the earth except him in Israel. Therefore, I pray, accept a present from your servant." But he answered, "By the life of the ever-living, before whom I stand, I will not accept it." Then he pressed him to take it, but he refused. Naaman then said, "If not, then let there be given to your servant a gift of 2 mule loads of earth. For your servant will never after now make offering and sacrifice to another god except the ever-living. Will the ever-living, however, forgive your servant for this thing? When my prince goes to the temple of Rimmon to bow there, and leans upon my arm to bow in the temple of Rimmon, if I bow in the temple of Rimmon, I pray the ever-living to forgive your servant for that thing." And he replied to him, "Go in peace." So he departed with his loads of earth. Gehazi, the attendant of Elisha the man of God, said to himself, "I see my master refrained from taking from the cargo of this Naaman the Aramite what he offered. By the life of the ever-living, if I don't run after him and get something for myself from him." Gehazi consequently ran after Naaman, and Naaman saw him running, and alighted from his chariot to go and meet him, and asked, "Is all well?" When he replied, "All is well. My master has sent me to say that there have just come to me 2 young men from Mount Ephraim, students of the preachers. Give me therefore a talent of silver and 2 robes of honor." And Naaman replied, "Will you not take 2 talents of silver?" And he pressed him, and put 2 talents of silver into 2 bags, and 2 robes of honor, and gave them to 2 of his own attendants, who carried them before him. When they came to the hill, he took them from their hands, and put them in the house, and dismissed the men, and they departed. He then went and stood before his master, and Elisha asked, "Where do you come from, Gehazi?" When he answered, "Your servant has not been anywhere." But he replied,
Went not my heart with you when the man descended from his chariot and came to meet you? Is this a time for you to take money, and take robes, and olive yards, and vineyards, and sheep and oxen, and men and women servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman the Aramite shall stick to you and your race forever. And he went from his presence a leper white as snow. The end of chapters 1 through 5. Chapter 6. The student preachers afterwards said to Elisha, "You see that the place where we reside with you is too small for us. Let us go therefore to the Jordan, and each one of us take a beam from there, and construct for us a residence to settle in." And he replied, "Go." But someone asked, "Will you not consent to go with us?" And he answered, "I will go." So he went with them, and they arrived at the Jordan, and selected the trees. But while one was felling the timber, the axe fell into the stream, so that he cried out and exclaimed, "Alas! Oh, master, it was borrowed." But the man of God asked, "Where did it fall?" So they showed him the place, when he seized a stick and thrust it there, and floated the iron, and said, "It floats for you," when he stretched out his hand and took it. At a time when the king of Aram was at war with Israel, his officers advised him, saying, "Fix your camp at such a place." But the man of God sent to the king of Israel to say, "Guard the passes at that place, or the king of Aram will encamp there." The king of Israel therefore sent to the passes which the man of God had intimated to him, and took precaution and guarded them, not once or twice. Consequently the heart of the king of Aram was depressed about the matter, so he summoned his officers, and asked them, "Can you inform me who is advising the king of Israel?" When one of his ministers answered, "Does not your majesty know that Elisha the preacher, who is in Israel, instructs the king of Israel about the things that you talk of in your bedchamber?" Then he said, "Go and ascertain where he is, and I will send and capture him." And they informed him, saying, "He is in Dothan." He consequently sent cavalry and charioteers, and a powerful force, who advanced by night and surrounded the village. But the man of God arose early to go up to worship, and went out, and saw a force surrounding the village with cavalry and charioteers, when his attendant exclaimed to him, "O master, what shall we do?" But he replied, "Fear not, for there are more with us than are with them." Then Elisha prayed and asked, "Ever-living, open his eyes and let him see." And the ever-living opened the eyes of the youth, and he saw, and perceived that the mountain was covered with cavalry and chariots of fire surrounding Elisha and descending with him. Then Elisha prayed to the ever-living and said, "Afflict these heathen with a blinding dazzle." And he afflicted them with a blinding dazzle, as Elisha asked. Then Elisha said to them, "That is not the road," and "This is not the road to the village. March after me, and I will lead you to the man whom you seek." But he led them to Shomeron, and when they came to Shomeron, Elisha said to the ever-living, "Open their eyes that they may see." When the ever-living opened their eyes, and they saw, they were in the marketplace of Shomeron. The king of Israel, however, asked Elisha, "Shall I cut them off? Shall I assail them, father?" But he replied, "You shall not assail them. Assail those you capture by your sword and your bow. Set food and water before these, and let them eat and drink, then go to their master." He consequently spread a great feast of food, and they ate and drank. Then he dismissed them, and they went to their prince, and the troops of Aram did not again invade the land of Israel. It was after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, collected all his forces, and came up to besiege Shomeron. A great famine consequently came in Shomeron while the siege was against it, until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and a quarter cab of peas for 5 silvers. And once, when the king was going to the wall, a woman appealed to him, saying, "Help, your majesty." When he replied, "The ever-living help you, for I cannot help you, either from the pantry or cellar." The king, however, asked her, "What is the matter with you?" When she replied, "This woman said to me, 'Give me your child, and we will eat it today. Then we will eat my son tomorrow.' And she boiled my son, and we ate him. But when I said the day after, 'Give me your son, that we may eat him,' she hid her son." When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his robes as he went on to the wall, and the people saw sackcloth was upon his body underneath them. And he exclaimed, "May God do so to me, and add to it, if the head of Elisha ben Shaphat shall stand upon him today." So he sent a man from his attendants. Now Elisha sat in his own house, and some gentlemen sat with him. And previous to the arrival of the messenger to him, he said to the gentleman, "Take care, for this son of murder has sent to take off my head. Look, there the messenger comes. Shut the door, send and keep him outside the doors, for is not the sound of his master's feet after him?" And whilst he was speaking to them, the king arrived and said, "This trouble is from the ever-living. Why should I longer trust on the ever-living?"
Chapter 7. But Elisha answered, "Hear the promise of the ever-living. By tomorrow at this time a saw of flour shall be a shekel, and a saw of barley shall be a shekel, at the gate of Shomeron." An officer on whose arm the king leaned sneered at the man of God, and said, "Ha! If the ever-living opened windows in the skies, could such a thing happen?" But he replied, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it." It happened there were 4 men, lepers, outside the gate, and one man said to his companion, "Wherever we turn we shall go to death. If we say we will go to the city, the famine is there, and we shall die. But if we turn to yonder, they will kill us. However, let us proceed to the camp of Aram. If they let us live, we shall live. But if they kill us, we can but die." They consequently rose up, encouraging themselves to go to the camp of Aram, and arrived at the outskirts of the camp of Aram, and found no one there, for the Almighty had caused to be heard in the camp of Aram a noise of chariots and a sound of cavalry, and the sound as of a great army, so that each said to his comrade, "Don't you see the king of Israel has hired against us the king of the Hittites and the kings of the Mizraim to come upon us?" They consequently arose and fled from themselves, and abandoned their baggage, their horses, and their asses in the camp as they were, and had run for their lives. And these lepers, having come to the skirts of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank, and carried off silver and gold, and clothing, and furniture, and hid them. Then they returned and came to another tent, and carried off from there, and went and hid it. At last one said to his companion, "We ought not to do so now, for this is a day of good news. Yet we are silent. And if we wait until dawn of day, they will discover our fault, and then they will come and catch and report us to the palace of the king." They therefore went and called at the gate, and informed them, saying, "We went to the camp of Aram, and saw neither a man nor a sound of men there, but only of horses in stall, and the tents as they were." The watch were consequently called, and they reported it to the king from their communication. So the king arose in the night, and said to his officers, "Inform me now, what do you think Aram is contriving against us? They know that we are famishing. So have they gone from the camp to entice us into the open field, thinking, they will come out of the city, when we will seize them alive and enter the town?" Then one of his officers answered and said, "Let them take the 5 remaining horses that are left to us, for they are like the whole lot of Israel that are left to her. They are like all the crowd of Israel that she possesses, and send out and ascertain." They consequently took the chariot horses, and the king sent after the army of Aram, ordering to go and examine. So they went to the Jordan, and found all the road full of accouterments and arms which the soldiers of Aram had thrown away. The messengers therefore returned and informed the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of Aram, and a saw of flour was sold for a shekel, and a saw of barley for a shekel, as the ever-living had said. And the king appointed the general upon whose arm he rested over the gate. But the crowd trod him under foot at the gate, and he was killed, as the man of God foretold when he spoke to the king when visiting him. For it occurred as the man of God said to the king, foretelling, "A saw of barley for a shekel, and a saw of flour for a shekel shall be bought at this time tomorrow at the gate of Shomeron." When a general sneered at the man of God and said, "Ha! If the ever-living made windows in the sky, could such an event as this come?" And he answered, "You yourself shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." But yet it came to him, for the crowd trod him under foot at the gate, and he was killed. Chapter 8. Elisha also warned the lady whose son he had revived for her, "Arise and go, yourself and family, and stay where you can stay, for the ever-living will call a famine, and also bring it upon the country for 7 years." The woman therefore arose, and did as the man of God commanded, and went with her family, and stayed in the country of the Philistine for 7 years. But when the 7 years were ended, the woman returned from the country of the Philistine, and came to appeal to the king for her house and land, while the king was speaking with Gehazi, the attendant of the man of God, and asking, "Tell me, I pray you, all the great things Elisha has done." And he was relating to the king how he had restored the dead to life, when the woman whose son had been restored to life appealed to the king about her house and land. Gehazi therefore said, "Your Majesty, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." The king then questioned the woman, and she told him, when the king committed her to an officer with an order to return to her all that was hers, with all the produce of the estate from the day she left the country until then. Elisha afterwards went to Damascus, when Ben-Hadad the king of Aram was sick, and it was reported to him that, "The man of God has come here." The king consequently said to Hazael, "Take a present with you, and go and meet the man of God, and inquire of the ever-living through him, if I shall recover from this sickness." Hazael therefore went to meet him, and took a present with him of all the best in Damascus, loaded upon 40 camels, and went and presented himself before him, and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you to ask, shall I recover from this illness?" When Elisha answered him, "Go, say, you will not live, for the ever-living has shown me he shall die." He, however, fixed himself before him, and stood stiff with insolence. Then the man of God wept. When Hazael asked, "Why do you weep, sir?" And he answered, "Because I know what cruelty you will do to the children of Israel. You will set fire to their towns, and murder their youths with the sword, and tear their infants to pieces, and rip up their women with child." Hazael, however, exclaimed, "What is your servant? Is he a dog, that he should do such horrible things?" When Elisha replied, "The ever-living has shown me yourself, when king over Aram." He then left Elisha and went to his prince, who asked him, "What did Elisha say to you?" And he replied, "He told me you should recover." But some days after he took a towel and dipped it in water, and spread it over his face, and he died, and Hazael reigned instead of him. In the 5th year of Joram ben Achab, king of Israel, Jehoram ben Jehoshaphat began to reign over Judah in conjunction with Jehoshaphat as kings of Judah. He was 32 years old at his coronation, and reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and went in the way of the kings of Israel as the family of Achab did, for a daughter of Achab was his wife. Thus he did evil in the sight of the ever-living. But the ever-living did not desire to wreck Judah because of David his servant, as he had promised to give him a light from his descendants for all time. In his days Edom revolted from under the control of Judah, and crowned a king over themselves. Joram consequently advanced to Zair, and all his charioteers with him. But Edom advanced by night, and defeated his outposts and the commanders of the chariots. So the army fled to their homes. Edom consequently revolted from under the control of Judah to this day, and Libnah also at the same time. The rest of the affairs of Joram, and all that he did, are written in the history of events in the days of the kings of Judah. When Joram slept with his fathers, he was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Ahaziah his son reigned after him. In the 12th year of Joram ben Achab, king of Israel, Ahaziah ben Jehoram began to reign in Judah. Ahaziah was 22 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Athaliah, a daughter of Gomri, king of Israel. And he walked in the path of the house of Achab, and did wrong in the sight of the ever-living, like the house of Achab. For he was connected by marriage to the family of Achab. When Joram ben Achab went to war with Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth-Gilead, the Aramites defeated Joram. King Joram returned to be cured to Jezreel of the wounds which the Aramites had given him at Ramoth, where he fought with Hazael, king of Aram. So Ahaziah ben Joram, king of Judah, came to visit Joram ben Achab in Jezreel when he was ill. Chapter 9. Then Elisha called one of the students of the preachers, and said to him, Gird up your waist, and take this flask of oil in your hand, and go to Ramoth-Gilead. When you arrive there, seek out Jehu ben Jehoshaphat ben Nimshi, and go and separate him from his companions, and take him with you to a private room. Then take the flask of oil, and pour it upon his head, and say, Thus says the ever-living, I have consecrated you king over Israel. Then open the door and fly, and do not delay. So the youth, the young preacher, went to Ramoth-Gilead. When he found the generals of the forces sitting together, and said, I have a message for you, general. And Jehu asked, To which of all of us? When he replied, For you, general. He therefore arose, and they went to his house, where he poured the oil upon his head, and said to him, Thus says the ever-living God of Israel, I have consecrated you king over the people of the ever-living, over Israel. And you shall cut off the house of Achab your master, and execute justice for me, for the blood of my servants the preachers, and the blood of all the servants of the ever-living from the hand of Isabel, and destroy every palace of Achab, and cut off from Achab every male and female or infant in Israel. For I will make the house of Achab like the house of Jeroboam ben Nebat, and like the house of Baasha ben Achiah, and the dogs shall devour Isabel in the streets of Jezreel, for she shall never be buried. Then he opened the door and fled. When Jehu returned to his master's officers, they asked him, Is all right? Why did that mad fellow come to you? And he answered, You know the man and his talk. But they replied, It is a lie. Come on, tell us. He consequently responded, He said this and that to me. Thus says the ever-living, I have consecrated you as king of Israel. Then they rushed, and everyone took his robe, and folded it under him on the platform of the doorsteps, and sounded the trumpet, and shouted, Jehu is king! Thus Jehu ben Jehoshaphat ben Nimshi conspired against Joram, when guarding Ramoth-Gilead for Joram from Hazael, king of Aram, while King Joram had retired to be cured in Jezreel of the wounds which the Aramites had given him in the fight with Hazael, king of Aram. Then Jehu said, If that is your intention, let none escape from the town to go to report in Jezreel. Jehu then mounted and marched towards Jezreel, for Joram was staying there, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, had come to visit Joram. A watchman, however, was posted on the tower in Jezreel, and he saw the squadrons of Jehu as they advanced. So he cried, I see squadrons! Joram ordered, Take a horseman and send to meet them, and inquire if all is peace. A horseman therefore went to meet him, and said, The king asks this, Is all peace? When Jehu replied, What have you to do with peace? Turn behind me. The watchman again reported, saying, The messenger arrived at them, but does not return. Then he sent a second horseman, who came to him and said, The king asks this, Is all peace? When Jehu answered, What have you to do with peace? Turn behind me. Again the watchman reported, saying, He arrived at them, but does not return. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu the son of Nimshi, for he drives like a madman. Then Joram exclaimed, Harness! And they harnessed his chariot, And Joram king of Israel went out with Ahaziah king of Judah, each in his chariot, and advanced to meet Jehu. And they met him at the farm of Naboth the Jezreelite. And when Joram saw Jehu, he asked, Is all peace, Jehu? But he answered, How can there be peace while the whoredoms of your mother Isabel and her personings are so many? Then Joram turned his hand and fled, and exclaimed to Ahaziah, It is a rebellion, Ahaziah! Jehu, however, seized his bow and hit Joram between his arms, and the arrow passed through his heart, and he dropped down in the chariot. Then he said to Bidkar, the general of his guards, Lift him up and fling him out on the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember, when I and you were riding together after Achab his father, the ever-living laid this burden upon him. As I saw the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons last night, says the Lord, I will repay it to you upon this very farm, the ever-living declared. So now take and fling him on to the spot according to the word of the ever-living. And Ahaziah king of Judah saw it. Then he fled towards the garden house, but Jehu followed after him and shouted, Him also! They wounded him in his chariot at the ascent of the summer house at Iblam. But he fled to Megiddo and died there, and his officers carried him in the chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in the graves of his fathers in the city of David. It was in the 11th year of Joram ben Achab that Ahaziah had begun to reign over Judah. But Isabel heard of the coming of Jehu towards Jezreel, so she painted her face and adorned her head, and looked out of a window. And when he came to the court, she asked, Had Zimri peace, who slew his master? But he raised his face to the window and called out, Who is on my side? Who? When 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out to him, then he shouted, Throw her down! So they threw her down, and her blood splashed the wall, and the horses who trampled upon her. Then he entered and ate and drank, and afterward said, Pick up that damned woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. They therefore went to bury her, but found nothing of her except her skull and feet and the palms of her hands. So they returned and reported it to him, when he remarked, It was the sentence of the ever-living which he delivered by the means of his servant Elia the Tishbite, saying, Upon the vineyard of Jezreel dogs shall eat the carcass of Isabel, and the carcass of Isabel shall become dung upon the surface of the ground of the farm of Jezreel, so that they cannot say, This was Isabel. Chapter 10. There were 70 sons of Achab in Shomeron. Therefore Jehu wrote letters and sent to Shomeron, as if from the nobles of Jezreel, and the counselors and nobles of Achab, to say, When this letter comes to you, you possess the sons of your prince, and chariots and horses, and a fortified city and an arsenal. Therefore choose the best and handsomest among the sons of your prince, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for the house of your prince. But they were very much afraid, and said, 2 kings could not stand against him, so we cannot resist him. Therefore the governor of the palace, and the governor of the city, and the counselors, and the guardians sent to Jehu to say, We are your servants, and we will do all you order us. You must make the best man in your own opinion king over us. He consequently wrote a second letter to them to say, If you are on my side, and will listen to my word, take the heads of those men, the sons of your prince, and come to me at this time tomorrow at Jezreel. The sons of the king were with the nobles of the city who had educated them. When this letter came to them, they took the sons of the king and slaughtered the 70 persons, and put their heads in baskets, and sent them to him at Jezreel. And a messenger came and reported to him, They have brought the heads of the sons of the king. When he replied, Put them in 2 heaps opposite the gate until morning. When it was morning, he went out, and stood, and addressed the people, and said, You are all honorable men. You know I conspired against my master and killed him, but who assailed all these? So you can learn now that not a word of the ever-living will fall to the earth of all that the ever-living spoke against the house of Achab, but the ever-living will do what he threatened by means of his servant Elia. Then Jehu executed the whole of the nobles of the house of Achab in Jezreel, and all his great men, and all his friends, and his priests, until not a remnant was left. He afterwards arose and advanced and marched to Shomeron. When he reached the shepherd's shearing house on the way, Jehu met the brothers of Ahaziah king of Judah, and asked, "Who are you?" And they answered, "We are the brothers of Ahaziah, and we are descending to visit the king's son and the sons of the nobles." But he commanded, "Seize them alive!" So they seized them alive, and slaughtered at the pit of the shearing house 42 persons, and spared not a single one of them. As he marched from there, he met Jonadab ben Rechab coming to meet him, and he addressed him and asked, "Is your heart right with me, as my heart is with your heart?" When Jehonadab replied, "It is." "If it is, give me your hand." So he gave his hand and mounted to him on the chariot, when he said, "Go with me and see my zeal for the ever-living." And he rode with him in the chariot. When he reached Shomeron, he assailed all the princes of Achab in Shomeron until he had destroyed them, according to the sentence of the ever-living that he pronounced by Elia. Jehu afterwards assembled the people, and said to them, "Achab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. Therefore now, all you preachers of Baal, all you servants of him, and all his priests, come to me, every man in his station, to make with me a big sacrifice to Baal. Every one who is not in his station will offer an insult to Jehu." But Jehu did it cunningly to destroy those servants of Baal. "Therefore," Jehu said, "proclaim an assembly to Baal." They accordingly proclaimed one, and Jehu sent through all Israel, and all the servants of Baal came. There was not a single one who did not come, and went to the temple of Baal, and filled the temple of Baal all over. He then said to the superintendent of the wardrobe, "Bring out uniforms for all the ministers of Baal." And he brought the uniforms out. Then Jehu and Jonadab ben Rechab came to the temple of Baal, and he said to the ministers of Baal, "Search and examine, for fear there should be among you any ministers of Jehovah, for I will expel all except the ministers of Baal." Then they entered and made sacrifices and burnt offerings. But Jehu had chosen for himself outside 80 men, and said, "The man who allows one of these fellows, whom I have prepared for your hands, to escape, his life shall be for his." So when they had finished making the burnt offering, Jehu commanded the infantry and their officers, "Advance! Charge! Let not a man come out!" Then the infantry and their officers charged with the sword, and went to the sanctuary of the temple of Baal. And they brought out the columns of the temple of Baal, and fired them, and threw down the temple of Baal, and turned it into a dunghill to this day. Thus Jehu swept Baal from Israel. However, Jehu did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who caused Israel to sin, from the worship of the calves of gold that were at Bethel and at Dan. Consequently, the ever-living said to Jehu, "Because you have done well and right in my sight, according to all that was in my heart that you should do to the house of Achab, 4 of your descendants shall sit upon the throne of Israel." Jehu, however, did not continue to walk in the laws of the ever-living God of Israel with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, who made Israel sin. In his days the ever-living lessened the boundaries of Israel, and Hazael conquered from them upon all the borders of Israel, from the Jordan eastward towards the sun, all the country of Gilead, the Gadites, and Reubenites, and Manassites, from Aroer upon the river Arnon, with Gilead and Bashan. The rest of the affairs of Jehu, and all that he did, and all his achievements, they are recorded in the history of the events of the times of the kings of Israel. When Jehu slept with his fathers, they buried him in Shomeron, and Jehoiachin his son reigned in his place. The period that Jehu was king over Israel was 28 years in Shomeron. The end of chapters 6 through 10. Chapter 11. When Athaliah the mother of Ahaziah saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed the whole of the royal family. Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, however, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the children of the king who were being murdered, and nursed him in a secret chamber, and concealed him from the sight of Athaliah, so he was not killed. He was afterwards hidden with her in the house of the ever-living for 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the country. But in the 7th year Jehoiada sent and invited the captains of the guards and infantry, and brought them to him in the house of the ever-living, and showed them the son of the king, and instructed them, saying, This is what you must do 3 days hence. Come on the Sabbath, and fix the guards to guard the king's palace, and relieve the guards at the gate, and dismiss the officers at the first gate, and yourselves remain to guard the temple from being entered. And let half of your troops come every Sabbath, and stand as a guard to keep the temple of the ever-living for the king, and form yourselves around the king, each with his arms in his hands, and if any refuses, let him be killed. You must also attend the king wherever he goes. The captains of the companies accordingly did all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and taking each his men, came on the Sabbath. When they arrived on the Sabbath, they came to Jehoiada the priest, and the priest gave to the captains of the companies the spears and shields, which since the time of King David had been in the temple of the ever-living. And the infantry were posted each with his arms in his hands at the right side of the temple, and at the left side of the temple, towards the altar, and towards the royal palace all round. Then he brought out the son of the king, and put to him the declaration and the constitution, and crowned him, and consecrated him, when they clapped hands and shouted, Long live the king! But Athaliah heard the shout of the troops and crowd, and went to the crowd in the temple of the ever-living, and looked, and saw the king standing by on a platform like a judge, and the captains and the courtiers of the king, and many people of the country besides, who applauded with the courtiers. Then Athaliah tore her robes and shouted, Treason! Treason! But Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains of the guards and officers of the army, saying to them, Take her out of the temple to the colonnade, and bring her to death by the sword. But, said the priest, kill her not in the house of the ever-living. They consequently laid hands on her, and brought her to the gangway of the cavalry barracks of the king, and killed her there. Jehoiada next read the covenant between the ever-living and the king and the people, which was to be maintained by the people towards the ever-living, and between the king and the people. The representatives of the country went afterwards to the temple of Baal, and threw down his altar, and smashed his image with delight, and killed Mattan the priest of Baal before his altar, and appointed a priest from the orders of the temple of the ever-living. He then collected the captains of the guards, and the bodyguard, and the courtiers, and representatives of the country, and brought the king down from the temple of the ever-living, and conducted him by way of the infantry gate to the royal palace, and set him upon the royal throne. All the representatives of the country rejoiced, and the city was content, when they had killed Athaliah by the sword at the royal palace. Chapter 12. Jehoash was 7 years old when he was crowned. In the 7th year of Jehu, Jehoash began to reign, and reigned 40 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Ziba of Beersheba. Jehoash did right in the sight of the ever-living, as Jehoiada the priest taught him, except that he did not overturn the columns. The people still sacrificed and offered incense at the columns. Jehoash also ordered the priests, All the statutory money that is collected for the house of the ever-living, the money from the personal tax, money assessed for lives, or which is offered by anyone freely who comes to the temple of the ever-living, let the priests take of it themselves, each for his salary, but let them repair the dilapidations of the temple, wherever they find it dilapidated. However, in the 13th year of King Jehoash, it was found the priests had not repaired the dilapidations of the temple. Consequently, King Jehoash summoned Jehoiada the high priest with the priests, and asked them, Why have you not repaired the dilapidations of the temple? Cease further to appropriate the money as wages for yourselves, but pay for the dilapidations of the temple. Therefore he prohibited the priests from collecting money from the people, because they did not repair the dilapidations of the temple. Consequently Jehoiada the priest prepared a box, and cut a hole in its lid, and placed it at the side of the altar, at the right-hand entrance to the house of the ever-living. And the priests on guard at the threshold put into it all the money brought to the temple of the ever-living, for the builders, the stonemasons, and workers in wood and carved stones, to repair the dilapidations of the house of the ever-living, and for all that was brought to the temple to repair it. But there were not made for the temple of the ever-living silver dishes for the sacrifices, tongs, forks, any instruments of gold or instruments of silver, from the money that was brought to the house of the ever-living, but it was paid to those doing the work, and they repaired the house of the ever-living with it. The men also to whom was entrusted the money to pay for doing the work were not dishonest, for they did it faithfully. The money from offerings and the money from fines for offenses was not brought into the temple of the ever-living. It belonged to the priests. At this time Hazael, king of Aram, advanced against Gath to attack it, and captured it. Then Hazael set his face to advance against Jerusalem, but Jehoiash king of Judah took all the consecrations that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Achaziah his ancestors, kings of Judah, had consecrated, and his own consecrations, and the gold found in the treasury of the temple of the ever-living and the royal palace, and sent it to Hazael, king of Aram. So he retreated from Jerusalem. The rest of the affairs of Jehoash and all he did are written in the history of the events during the period of the kings of Judah. His ministers, however, arose and conspired and assailed Jehoash at Beth-milah in the vale of Selah, where Josachar ben Chamath and Josaber ben Shemer, his ministers, assaulted him, and he was killed, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Amaziah his son reigned in his stead. Chapter 13. In the 23rd year of Joash son of Achaziah king of Judah, Jehoachaz ben Jehu began to reign over Israel in Shomeron for 17 years. But he did wrong in the sight of the ever-living, and followed after the sin of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who made Israel sin. He did not turn from it. Consequently, the ever-living was angry with Israel, and he delivered it to the power of Hazael, king of Aram, and to the power of Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, all their time. Jehoachaz afterwards turned to the ever-living, and he rescued him, for the ever-living pitied the distress of Israel. For the kings of Aram distressed them. Therefore the ever-living gave to Israel a relief, and they escaped from beneath the hand of Aram, and the children of Israel returned to their homes as formerly. However, they did not abandon the sins of the house of Jeroboam with which Israel had gone to sin. The shrine was also left in Shomeron. No army was, however, left to Jehoachaz except 50 cavalry, and 10 chariots, and 10,000 infantry. For the king of Aram had destroyed them, and made them like dust to the tempest. The remainder of the affairs of Jehoachaz, and all he did, and his courage, are recorded in the history of the events of the kings of Israel. When Jehoachaz slept with his fathers, they buried him in Shomeron, and Jehoash his son reigned after him. In the 27th year of Jehoash king of Judah, Jehoash son of Jehoachaz began to reign over Israel in Shomeron for 16 years. But he did wrong in the sight of the ever-living. He turned not from the sin of Jeroboam ben Nebat, which he caused Israel to sin. He followed it. As to the other affairs of Jehoash, and all that he did, and his courage, how he fought with Amaziah king of Judah, they are recorded in the history of events during the period of the kings of Israel. Then Jehoash slept with his fathers, and Jeroboam sat on his throne, and he buried Jehoash in Shomeron with the kings of Israel. When Elisha was ill with the illness that was his death, Jehoash king of Israel visited him, and wept before him, and exclaimed, "My father, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horses!" Then Elisha said to him, "Take a bow and arrows." So he took a bow and arrows. He next said to the king of Israel, "Draw the bow with your hands." And he drew the bow with his hands, and Elisha put his hands on the hands of the king, and said, "Open the window towards the east." So he opened it. Then Elisha said, "Shoot." And he shot. When he exclaimed, "An arrow of deliverance from the ever-living, and an arrow of deliverance against Aram, for you shall defeat Aram with a crash to destruction." Then he added, "Take your arrows." And he took. Then he said to the king of Israel, "Shoot at the ground." So he shot 3 times, then stopped. And the man of God was angry, and exclaimed to him, "You should have shot 5 or 6 times, then you would have defeated Aram to destruction. But now you have only defeated Aram 3 times. Then Elisha died, and they buried him when the raiders from Moab were coming into the country at the fall of the year. They were burying another man also, But when they saw the raiders, they threw the man into the grave of Elisha and ran away. When, however, the man touched the corpse of Elisha, he arose on his feet. Hazael, king of Aram, then oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoiachin, but afterwards the ever-living pitied them and showed mercy, and turned towards them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and did not desire to desolate them, nor to throw them from his presence at that time. Therefore Hazael, king of Aram, died, and Ben-Hadad his son reigned after him. Then Jehoash turned upon Ben-Hadad, and took the cities from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, which he had taken from the possession of his father Jehoiachin. Jehoash defeated him in battle 3 times, and recovered the towns to Israel. Chapter 14. In the 2nd year of Jehoash king of Israel, Amaziah ben Jehoash began to reign in Judah. He was 25 years old at his coronation, and was king in Jerusalem for 29 years, and his mother's name was Jehoaddin of Jerusalem. And he did right in the sight of the ever-living, not, however, like his ancestor David, but exactly as his father Jehoash did. Yet he did not take away the columns. The people still offered sacrifice and incense at the columns. When he had fixed himself firmly in possession of the kingship, he executed those ministers of his father who had killed the king his father. But he did not kill the sons of the murderers, because it is written in the law of Moses that the ever-living commanded, saying, "You shall not kill the parents on account of their children, and you shall not kill the children on account of their parents. A man shall only be killed for his own crime." He defeated 10,000 of Edom and the Amalekites, and seized Selah by war, and called its name Jokthal to this day. Then Amaziah sent ambassadors to Jehoash ben Jehoiachin, the descendant of Jehu king of Israel, to say, "Come, let us see faces." But Jehoash king of Israel sent to Amaziah king of Judah to say, "A bramble in Lebanon once sent to the cedar of Lebanon to say, 'Give your daughter to my son as a wife.' Then a wild beast that was in Lebanon passed and trod down the bramble. You have defeated Edom, and so your heart rises in pride. But go home. Why should you excite trouble, and fall yourself, and all Judah with you?" Amaziah would not listen, however, but advanced against Jehoash king of Israel, and they saw each other's faces, he and Amaziah king of Judah, at Bethshemesh, which is in Judah, where Judah was routed before Israel, and every one fled to his house. And Amaziah ben Jehoash ben Ahaziah king of Judah was also captured by Jehoash king of Israel at Bethshemesh, who then advanced to Jerusalem, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate, 400 cubits. He also took all the gold and silver and the furniture that he found in the temple of the ever-living, or that was found in the royal palace, and his children for hostages. Then he returned to Shomeron. For the other affairs of Jehoash, what he did, and his achievements, and how he fought with Amaziah king of Judah, they are related in the history of events during the times of the kings of Judah. When Jehoash slept with his fathers, he was buried in Shomeron with the kings of Israel, and Jeroboam his son reigned after him. Amaziah ben Joash, however, reigned over Judah after the death of Jehoash ben Ahaziah king of Israel for 15 years. But the other affairs of Amaziah are written in the history of events in the period of the kings of Judah. When they conspired against him in Jerusalem, he fled to Lachish, but they sent after him to Lachish and murdered him there. They, however, carried him with the horsemen to Jerusalem, and buried him with his fathers in the city of David. The people of Judah took Azariah, who was 10 years old, and crowned him in place of his father Amaziah. He built Elath and restored it to Judah. The king afterwards slept with his fathers. In the 15th year of Amaziah ben Jehoash king of Judah, Jeroboam ben Jehoash king of Israel began to reign in Shomeron for 41 years. But he did wrong in the sight of the ever-living. He turned not from any of the sins of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who caused the sin of Israel. He restored the boundaries of Israel from Chamath to the sea of the desert, according to the promise of the ever-living God of Israel, which he promised by means of Jonah ben Amittai the preacher, who came from Gath-Kapher. For the ever-living pitied the immeasurable miseries of Israel both without and within, when there was no ease for Israel. The ever-living had not yet decided to blot the name of Israel from beneath the heavens, therefore he rescued it by the hand of Jeroboam ben Joash. For the other affairs of Jeroboam, and all that he did, how he warred, and how he recaptured Damascus and come out of Judah to Israel, they are recorded in the history of events of the days of the kings of Israel. Then Jeroboam slept with his fathers, with the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son reigned after him. Chapter 15. In the 17th year of Jeroboam king of Israel, Azariah ben Amaziah king of Judah began to reign. He was 16 years old at his coronation, and reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. And he did right in the eyes of the ever-living, as Amaziah his father did. Yet he did not throw down the columns. The people still sacrificed and offered incense at the columns. The ever-living, however, afflicted the king, and he became a leper towards the time of his death, and resided in a separate house. And Jotham the son of the king was chief justice for the public. For the other affairs of Azariah, they are related in the history of events during the days of the kings of Judah. When Azariah slept with his fathers, they buried him with his ancestors in the city of David, and Jotham his son succeeded him as king. In the 38th year of Azariah king of Judah, Zechariah ben Jeroboam began to reign over Israel in Shomeron for 6 months. But he did wrong in the sight of the ever-living as his fathers did. He turned not from the sins of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who caused the sin of Israel. Shallum ben Jabesh, however, conspired against him, and assailed him in public, and killed him, and reigned in his place. But the rest of the affairs of Zechariah are recorded in the history of events during the period of the kings of Israel. He completed the promise of the ever-living which he promised to Jehu, saying, 4 of your descendants shall sit upon the throne of Israel. And it was so. Shallum ben Jabesh began to reign in the 39th year of Azariah king of Judah, and he reigned a month in Shomeron, when Menachem ben Gadai of Thirza came to Shomeron, and attacked Shallum ben Jabesh in Shomeron, and killed him, and reigned instead of him. As to the other affairs of Shallum, and his conspiracy that he conspired, they are recorded in the history of events in the days of the kings of Israel. Menachem afterwards assailed Thifsa and all who were in it, and its suburbs, and Thirza, because they did not surrender, and murdered all the women with child by ripping them up. In the 39th year of Azariah king of Judah, Menachem ben Gadai began to reign over Israel in Shomeron. But he did evil in the sight of the ever-living. He turned not from the sins of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who caused the sin of Israel all his time. Pul, king of Ashur, advanced against the country, but Menachem gave to Pul 1,000 talents of silver to be his ally, to secure the kingship in his hands. Menachem collected the money from Israel and from the officers of the army to give to the king of Ashur, 50 silver shekels from each person. So the king of Ashur retreated, and did not remain in the country. As to the other affairs of Menachem, and all that he did, they are related in the history of events of the days of the kings of Israel. When Menachem slept with his fathers, Pekahiah his son reigned after him. In the 50th year of Azariah king of Judah, Pekahiah ben Menachem began to reign in Shomeron. But he did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who caused the sin of Israel. And Pekach ben Remaliah his general conspired against him, and assailed him at Shomeron in the royal palace, with Argob and Uraya and 50 other men from the people of Gilead, and reigned in his place. The other affairs of Pekahiah, and all that he did, are recorded in the history of events during the period of the kings of Israel. In the 52nd year of Azariah king of Judah, Pekach ben Remaliah began to reign over Israel for 20 years. But he did evil in the sight of the ever-living. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam ben Nebat, who caused the sin of Israel. In the time of Pekach king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser king of Ashur came and seized Aion and the meadows of Beth-Makkah, and Janok, and Kadesh, and Katzur, and Gilad, and Galilee, with all the country of Naphtali, and removed them to Ashur. Then Hoshea ben Allah conspired against Pekach ben Remaliah, and assailed and murdered him, and reigned in his place in the 20th year of Jotham ben Uzziah. As to the other affairs of Pekach, and all that he did, they are related in the history of the events of the times of the kings of Israel. In the 2nd year of Pekach ben Remaliah king of Israel, Jotham ben Uzziah, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 15 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Eosha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did right in the eyes of the ever-living, in everything as his father Azariah had done. However, he did not overturn the columns. The people still sacrificed and offered incense at the columns. He built the high gate at the house of the ever-living. But the rest of the affairs of Jotham, and all that he did, are written of in the history of events during the period of the kings of Judah. At this period the ever-living began to send to Judah Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekach ben Remaliah. When Jotham slept with his fathers, he was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Ahaz his son succeeded him. The end of chapters 11 through 15. Chapter 16. In the 17th year of Pekach ben Remaliah, Ahaz ben Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 12 years old at his coronation, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, but did not do right in the sight of the ever-living God, like David his ancestor. He followed the path of the kings of Israel, and even passed his children through the fire, like the foul heathen whom the ever-living drove before the face of the children of Israel. He also sacrificed and offered incense at the columns, and upon the hills, and under every leafy tree. Consequently Rezin, king of Aram, came, and Pekah ben Remaliah, king of Israel, against Jerusalem to war, and besieged Ahaz, but were not able to succeed. But at that time Rezin recaptured Eiloth to Aram, and drove the Jews out of Eiloth, and brought Aramites to Eiloth, and settled them there to this day. Ahaz consequently sent ambassadors to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Ashur, to say, "I am your slave and son. Come and save me from the hand of the king of Aram, and from the hand of the king of Israel, who have risen up against me." He also took the silver and gold found in the temple of the ever-living, and in the treasuries of the royal palace, and sent to the king of Ashur as a present. The king of Ashur consequently listened to him. So the king of Ashur advanced against Damascus, and captured it, and transported to Caira, and killed Rezin. King Ahaz went to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Ashur, at Damascus, where he saw the altar that was in Damascus. The king consequently sent to Uriah the priest a drawing of that altar, and the building of it, with all its formation. And Uriah the priest built an altar exactly like what the king sent to him from Damascus. Uriah the priest made it against the return of King Ahaz from Damascus. When the king returned from Damascus and saw the altar, the king approached to the altar, and offered sacrifice upon it, and put incense on the burnt offering with its bread, and poured the drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of the thank offerings which he made upon the altar. For he had removed the brazen altar that was before the ever-living from the front of the house, between his altar and the temple of the ever-living, and placed it at the north side of his altar. For the king had ordered Uriah the priest, saying, "Burn incense upon this grand altar with the morning sacrifice, with the food offering in the evening, and burnt offering of the king, and its food offering, and the burnt offering for all the people of the country, and their food offerings, and their drink offerings, and all the blood offerings, and all the blood of sacrifice sprinkled upon it. But the brazen altar shall be for me in the morning." Uriah the priest consequently did exactly as he was ordered by King Ahaz, who also broke down the guard of the bases, and removed from them the baths, and took down the sea from the oxen of brass which were under it, and placed it upon blocks of stone. And the intervening screen which was built between the temple and the royal entrance to the court that surrounded the house of the ever-living he removed for the sake of the king of Ashur. The other things that Ahaz did are related in the history of events in the period of the kings of Judah. When Ahaz slept with his fathers, he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and Hezekiah his son succeeded him. Chapter 17. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea ben Allah began to reign in Shomeron over Israel for 9 years. But he did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Ashur, advanced against him, and Hoshea became his subject, and paid him tribute. However, the king of Ashur discovered Hoshea was conspiring when he sent ambassadors to Suah, king of Egypt, and did not send up the yearly tribute to the king of Ashur. The king of Ashur consequently deposed and confined him in a fortress. The king of Ashur also invaded the whole country, and ravaged it for 3 years. In the 7th year of Hoshea, the king of Ashur captured Shomeron, and transported Israel to Ashur, and settled them in Kalach, and adjoining the river Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. It was because the children of Israel, with the kings they made, sinned against their ever-living God, who had brought them up from the land of the Mitzrayim, from under the hand of Pharaoh king of the Mitzrayim, and reverenced foreign gods, and walked in the customs of the heathen, whom the ever-living drove out before the children of Israel. The children of Israel also sinned in other things, not being accordant with their ever-living God, and built columns for themselves in all their cities, with observatory towers in the fortified cities. And they set up pillars for themselves, and shrines upon every hilltop, and under every leafy tree. They also burnt incense at all the columns like the heathen, to provoke the ever-living, and served idols, although the ever-living said to them, "You shall not make any such things." Yet the ever-living had warned Israel and Judah by means of his preachers and every prophet, saying, "Turn from your evil paths, and keep my commandments and institutions, according to the perfect laws that I ordained for your ancestors, and that I sent to you by the hands of my servants, the preachers." They did not, however, listen, but stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers, who were not faithful to their ever-living God, and abandoned his institutions and his covenant, which he made with their forefathers, and the evidences that he showed them, and went after imaginations, and worshipped fancies, and followed the heathen around them, of whom the ever-living commanded, "You shall not do like them." Thus they abandoned the whole of the commands of their ever-living God, and made 2 metal calves, and shrines, and bowed down to all the host of the skies, and served Baal, and passed their sons and daughters through the fire, and practiced divination, and worshipped snakes, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the ever-living, and provoked him. Consequently the ever-living was very angry with Israel, and turned them from his presence, reserving none except the tribe of Judah alone. Judah also did not regard the commands of their ever-living God, but followed the same customs as Israel. Therefore the ever-living rejected all the race of Israel, and reduced them, and gave them to the power of the plunderers, until he sent them from his presence. For he tore Israel from off the house of David, and they crowned Jeroboam ben Nebat, and Jeroboam led Israel from following the ever-living, and caused them to sin the great sin. So the children of Israel went into all the sin that Jeroboam practiced. They never turned from it until the ever-living turned Israel from his presence, as he threatened by the means of all his servants the preachers, and rolled Israel from its land to Ashur to this day. Then the king of Ashur brought people from Babel, and from Cush, and from Awa, and from Chamath, and from Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Shomeron, and they colonized its towns. But it resulted that the newcomers who were settled there did not reverence the ever-living, so the ever-living sent lions upon them, who killed them. Consequently they reported to the king of Ashur, saying, "The nations you have deported and settled in the towns of Shomeron do not know the decrees of the God of the country, so he has sent lions to them, who kill them, because they have no knowledge of the decrees of the God of the country." Consequently the king of Ashur said, "Send there some of the priests whom I have transported from there, and let them go and reside there, and teach them the decrees of the God of the country." Therefore some of the priests who had been transported from Shomeron returned to Bethel, and taught them how to worship the ever-living. But they, nation by nation, also made their own gods, and fixed them in the houses of columns which the Shomerites had constructed, nation by nation, in their towns where they resided. Thus the people of Babel made booths for girls, the people of Cush made Nergal, the people of Chamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nibkaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burnt their sons in fire to Adramelech and Agmelech, gods of the Sepharvites. Yet they worshipped the ever-living, but made for themselves priests from the mass of the priests of the columns, and also made for themselves temples of columns. They worshipped the ever-living, and the gods they were serving, according to the customs of the nation from whence they were transported. Chapter 18. It was in the 3rd year of Hoshea ben Allah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah ben Ahaz began to reign in Judah. He was 15 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the ever-living, exactly as his ancestor David did. He threw down the columns, and smashed the pillars, and cut down the shrines, and broke up the brazen serpent which Moses had made, for until this period the children of Israel offered incense to it. But he called it old brass. He adhered to the ever-living God of Israel. He never turned from following him, and regarded the commands that the ever-living commanded to Moses. So the ever-living was with him wherever he went. He acted wisely, and revolted from the king of Ashur, and served him not. He conquered the Philistine in Gaza and its district, from the fortress of Migdol to the city of Mitzab. But in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th of Hoshea ben Allah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Ashur, advanced to Shomeron, and besieged it, and captured it at the end of 3 years. In the 7th year of Hezekiah, which was the 10th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, he captured Shomeron. Then the king of Ashur transported Israel to Ashur, and planted them in Kalach, and in the district of the river Gozan, and the cities of the Medes, because they would not listen to the voice of their ever-living God, but transgressed the covenant, the whole of which had been commanded to Moses, the servant of the ever-living. But they would not listen nor obey. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib king of Ashur advanced against all the fortified cities of Judah, and seized them. Consequently Hezekiah king of Judah sent to the king of Ashur at Lachish, to say, I have done wrong. Return from me, and what you impose upon me I will pay. So the king of Ashur laid upon Hezekiah king of Judah 300 talents of silver, and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah paid him all the silver found in the house of the ever-living, and in the treasuries of the royal palace. At the same time Hezekiah stripped it from the doors of the temple of the ever-living, and the doorposts which Hezekiah king of Judah had plated, and gave it to the king of Ashur. Yet the king of Ashur sent Tartan, and Rabsaris, and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah, with a powerful army to Jerusalem, and they advanced and arrived at Jerusalem, and on arrival stationed themselves at the ascent of the high reservoir, which is by the highway of the potter's field. From there they called for the king, and he sent out to them Eliakim ben Hilkiah, who was superintendent of the palace, and Shebna the secretary, and Joach ben Asaph the recorder. And Rabshakeh said to them, Say to Hezekiah, the great king, the king of Ashur, asks this, What is the protector upon whom you rely? You say, but they are empty words. I have genius and strength for the war. On whom did you rely when you revolted from me? Look now, you trusted yourself upon that broken reed, upon Mitzer, upon which if a man leans, it runs into his hand and pierces it. Such is Pharaoh, king of the Mitzrayim, to all who trust upon him. But if you reply to me, We trust on our ever-living God, is not that he whose columns and whose altars Hezekiah has thrown down, and ordered Judah and Jerusalem to bow towards the altar of Jerusalem? But, however, come over, I say, to my master the king of Ashur, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able to put riders upon them for yourself. So how can you turn back the face of one of the last of my master's captains, and trust yourself to Mitzer for chariots and horsemen? However, have I advanced against this place without an order from the ever-living to destroy it? The ever-living said to me, Invade that country and devastate it. Here Eliakim ben Hilkiah, and Shebna, and Joach said to Rabshakeh, Speak to your servants, we beg, in Aramith, for we understand it, and do not speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the soldiers on the wall. But Rabshakeh replied to them, Did my master send me to speak to your master, or to you, the things that I am saying? Was it not to the men on the wall, who eat their own dung and drink their own piss with you? Then Rabshakeh stood up and shouted with a loud voice in Hebrew, and spoke and said, Listen to the words of the great king, the king of Ashur. Thus says the king, Let not Hezekiah mislead you, for he is not able to deliver you from my hand. And let not Hezekiah himself trust on the ever-living, saying, The ever-living will deliver, and not give this city to the hand of the king of Ashur. Listen not to Hezekiah, for the king of Ashur says this,
make a treaty with me, and come out to me, and let every one eat of his own grapes, and every one his own figs, and every one drink water from his own well, until I come and take you to a land like your own land, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olives, oil, and honey, where you can live and not die. And listen not to Hezekiah, who deceives you by saying, The Lord will deliver us. Have the gods of the nations delivered any one of their countries from the hand of the king of Ashur? Where are the gods of Chamath and Arphad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Ina, and Ava, who delivered Shomeron from my hand? The people, however, were silent, and did not answer him a word, for the king's command was to give him no reply. Then Eliakim ben Hilkiah, superintendent of the palace, and Shebna the secretary, and Joach ben Asaph the recorder, returned to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, and reported to him the speech of Rabshakeh. Chapter 19. And when Hezekiah heard it, he tore his robes, and put on sackcloth, and went to the house of the ever-living. He also sent Eliakim, superintendent of the palace, and Shebna the secretary, and the chief priests with them to Isaiah the preacher, and son of Amoz. And they said to him, The king says this, It is a time of distress and reproach and derision today, for the children have come to the birth, and there is not strength to bear them. Has not your ever-living God heard all the utterances of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Ashur his master has sent to insult the God of life and abuse him, with the speeches your ever-living God has heard? So raise a prayer for the remnant remaining. Thus the ministers of King Hezekiah related to Isaiah, and Isaiah replied to them, You can say to your king, The ever-living says this, Fear not for the words you have heard spoken, with which the officers of the king of Ashur have reviled me. I will send a wind upon him, and he shall hear its report, and return to his own country, and fall by the sword in his own land. Rabshakeh consequently retreated, and met his king besieging Libnah, for he heard he had marched from Lachish, because he had heard a report about Thirachah, king of Cush, saying that he was coming to make war on him. Therefore he retreated. However, he sent messengers to Hezekiah to threaten, Say this to Hezekiah, king of Judah, Do not exalt your God on whom you trust, saying, He will not give Jerusalem to the hands of the king of Ashur. Reflect how you have heard what the kings of Ashur have done to all the countries they devoted to conquest. So shall you escape? Did the gods of the nations deliver those who worshipped them from my forefathers, Gozan and Charan, or the children of Aden who were in Thalasar? Where is the king of Chamath, and the king of Arphad, and the king of the cities of the Sepharvaim, Ina or Ava? Hezekiah, however, took the letter from the hands of the ambassadors, and read it. Then he went up to the house of the ever-living, where Hezekiah spread it before the Supreme. Hezekiah also prayed before the ever-living, and said, Ever-living God of Israel, you seated among the cherubim are God alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. Eternal life, incline your ears and listen. Open your eyes, ever-living, and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to insult the God of life. Truly, Lord, the kings of Ashur have destroyed nations and their countries, and flung their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but only the product of human hands, of wood and stone. But you, our ever-living God, can certainly save us from his hand, when all the kingdoms of the world will know that you are the living God, and you alone. Isaiah ben Amoz also sent to Hezekiah to say, Thus says the living God of Israel, When you prayed to me about Sennacherib king of Ashur, I heard you. This is the reply that the ever-living gives to him. At you the virgin daughter of Zion laughs, Jerusalem's daughter shakes her head. Against whom is your libelous insult? Against whom do you raise your voice and lift up your insolent eyes? Against the Holy of Israel. By your ambassador's hand you have insulted my prince. You said, I will ride in my chariot over the hilltops, over Lebanon's stride, and fell his tall cedars, and beautiful pines, and lodge at the side of the forest of Carmel. I have dug and have drunk of the sparkling waters, and have dried with my soul all the moats of the forts. Have you not heard from afar of my actions aforetime, how I planned to make great cities desolate heaps, made them weak to your hand, and their people like field grass, and green weeds on a roof scorched before they are grown? All your campings and march and advancing I knew, and your rage against me, yes, your fury at me, and your roaring has come to my ears. So my hook I will put in your nose, and my bit in your jaws, and by the way that you came, lead you back. For your proof, eat the self-sown this year, and next year the same. And the third, sow and reap, dress the vines and eat fruits. For Judah's house shall grow up from its fragments, branches spring from the root and bear fruit up aloft. From Jerusalem fragments shall go and escape from Mount Zion. The power of the Lord will do this. Ashur's king shall not come to this town, says the Lord, nor shoot there an arrow, nor lift up a shield, nor heap up a rampart against it. By the way he advanced, by that way he shall go, and not come to the city, the Lord has declared. I shield it and save it because of myself, and David the servant to me.
And it occurred that in the same night a messenger from the ever-living came and struck in the camp of Ashur 175,000. When they awoke in the morning, they found all these dead corpses. Then Sennacherib king of Ashur struck tents, marched, and returned to Nineveh, where, when praying in the house of Nisroch his god, Adramelech and Shartzar his sons assailed him with the sword, and escaped to the district of Ararat, and Asarhaddon his son reigned after him. Chapter 20. About this time Hezekiah had a serious sickness, so Isaiah came to him and said, Thus says the ever-living, arrange for your family, for you will die and not live. He in consequence turned his face to the wall and prayed to the ever-living, saying, I entreat you, ever-living, to remember how I walked before you in truth, and with a thankful heart, and the good I have done in your sight. Then Hezekiah wept with much weeping. And it happened that Isaiah had not gone halfway to the town, when the message of the ever-living came to him, to say, Return and say to Hezekiah the shepherd of my people, Thus says the ever-living God of David your ancestor, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears, I will cure you. 3 days hence you shall go up to the house of the ever-living. I will also add to your days 15 years, and I will deliver you from the hand of the king of Ashur with this city, and I will protect this city, because of myself and because of David my servant. Isaiah then said, Take a plaster of figs, and apply it to the inflammation, and he will live. But Hezekiah asked Isaiah, What evidence is there that the ever-living will cure me, and that I shall 3 days hence go up to the house of the ever-living? When Isaiah replied, This is the evidence from the ever-living to you, that the ever-living will fulfill the promise he has promised. The shadow that has gone upwards 10 degrees, shall it turn back the 10 degrees it has risen? Hezekiah, however, answered him, It is easy for the shadow to advance 10 degrees on the sundial, but not for the shadow to go back 10 degrees. But Isaiah the preacher called to the ever-living, and the shadow turned back from the advance, which it had gone upon the sundial of Ahaz, receding 10 degrees. At this time Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babel, sent letters and presents to Hezekiah, for he had heard that Hezekiah had been ill. And Hezekiah listened to them, and showed them all the stores of his treasures, the silver and gold, and perfumes, and the fine oil, and all the arsenal of his armor, and everything contained in his treasuries. There was nothing that Hezekiah did not show them in his palace and in his dominions. Consequently Isaiah the preacher came to the king Hezekiah, and asked him, What did those men say, and from whom have they come to you? And Hezekiah answered him, From a distant country. They came from Babel. Then he asked, What did you show them in your palace? When Hezekiah replied, They have seen all that is in my palace. There is nothing in my treasuries which they have not seen. But Isaiah answered Hezekiah, Listen to a message from the ever-living. Look, the days are coming when all that is in your palace, and which your forefathers have stored up to this day, will be carried to Babel. Not a thing will be left, says the ever-living, and your sons who proceed from you, whom you have produced, will be seized and made eunuchs in the temple of the kings of Babel." Hezekiah only replied to Isaiah, "The message from the ever-living that you have delivered is good, for it says that peace and safety shall be in my days." Regarding the rest of the affairs of Hezekiah and all his achievements, and how he made the reservoirs and the aqueducts, and brought the waters to the city, they are recorded in the history of events of the times of the kings of Judah. But Hezekiah slept with his fathers, and Manasseh his son reigned after him. The end of chapters 16 through 20. Chapter 21. Manasseh was 12 years old at his coronation, and reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hephzibah. But he did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living, like the abominable heathen whom the ever-living drove out before the children of Israel. He also restored and built the columns that Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and raised altars to Baal, and made shrines like Ahab king of Israel did, and bowed to all the host of the skies, and served them, and built them altars in the house of the ever-living, although the ever-living had said, "In Jerusalem I will place my name." He also built altars to all the host of the skies in the 2 courts of the house of the ever-living, and passed his son through the fire, to the clouds, and to the serpent, and practiced necromancy, and used soothsayers, continually increasing to do evil in the sight of the ever-living, to insult him. He even fixed the image of fortune that he had made in the house, which the ever-living said to David and to Solomon his son, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will fix my name forever, and I will not again cause the feet of Israel to wander from the land that I gave to their forefathers, if only they continue to practice all that I commanded them, and all the laws that Moses my servant ordered for them." But they would not listen. Manasseh thus apostatized to practice sin with the heathen, whom the ever-living swept from before the children of Israel. The ever-living consequently sent a message by the hands of his servants the preachers, to say, "Since Manasseh king of Judah has practiced these hideous sins, worse than all that the Amorites who preceded him, and Judah has also sinned with his idols, therefore thus says the ever-living God of Israel, I will bring such evil upon Jerusalem and Judah that both the ears of all who hear it shall tingle, and I will extend over Jerusalem the rule of Shomeron, and the plummet of the house of Ahab, and overturn Jerusalem as a bowl is overturned and flung on its face. I will also abandon the remnant of my inheritance, and give them to the hand of their enemies, and they shall become a contempt and scorn to all their enemies, because they have done wrong in my sight, and have been an irritation to me, from the day I brought their fathers from among the Mizraim to this day. And Manasseh has also shed very much innocent blood, until he has filled Jerusalem from face to face, to destroy it with the sins he has caused Judah to sin, by doing evil in the sight of the ever-living." As to the other affairs of Manasseh, and all that he did, and the sins that he sinned, they are related in the history of events during the period of the kings of Judah. At last Manasseh slept with his fathers, and was buried in the garden of his palace, in the park of Uzzah, and Amon his son succeeded him. Amon was 22 years of age at his coronation, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Meshullemeth, daughter of Charots of Jotbah. He, however, did wrong in the sight of the ever-living, as Manasseh his father had done, and followed all the ways his father went, and served the idols that his father served, and bowed to them. He also forsook the ever-living God of his ancestors, and did not walk in the paths of the ever-living. So the officers of Amon conspired against him, and killed the king in his palace. The country people, however, assailed all the conspirators against King Amon, and elected his son Josiah king in his place. The rest of the things that Amon did are recorded in the history of events in the times of the kings of Judah. And they buried him in his own tomb in the park of Uzzah, and his son Josiah reigned after him. Chapter 22. Josiah was 8 years old at his coronation, and reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And the name of his mother was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah of Betzekath. And he did right in the sight of the ever-living, and walked in all the paths of his ancestor David, and did not turn to the right or left. It occurred in the 18th year of King Josiah that the king sent Shaphan ben Atzaliah the secretary to the house of the ever-living to say, "Go to Hilkiah the high priest, and let him keep the money coming into the house of the ever-living, separate from what they collect from the people, and deposit it in the custody of Asaph, the accountant of the property of the house of the ever-living, to repair the dilapidations of the house, to pay carpenters and masons and builders, and purchase timber and dressed stone to repair the temple." However, he did not reckon with them for the money placed in their hands, for they acted faithfully. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law, in the house of the ever-living." So Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan when he met him, and Shaphan carried the book to the king when the king sat at business, and said, "Your officers have collected the money found in the temple, and placed it in the custody of Asaph, the accountant of the property of the house of the ever-living." Then Shaphan showed the book to the king, and said, "Hilkiah the priest gave me this book." And Shaphan read it before the king. But when the king heard the contents of the book of the law, he tore his robes. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest, and Achikam ben Shaphan, and Achbor ben Micaiah, and Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the attendant of the king, saying, "Go, inquire of the ever-living about me, and about the people, and about all Judah in regard to the contents of this book that has been found. For a great anger from the ever-living must be kindled against us, because our ancestors have not listened to the commands of this book, or practiced all that was written for us." Hilkiah the priest, and Achikam, and Achbor, and Shaphan, and Asaiah went therefore to Huldah the reciter, the wife of Shallum ben Thigna ben Carcas, keeper of the robes, who resided in Jerusalem in the second rank of the Levites, and spoke to her. And she replied to them, "The ever-living God of Israel says thus, Say to the man who sent you to me, Thus says the ever-living, I will bring misery upon this place and upon its inhabitants in accordance with the contents of the book read to the king of Judah, because they have abandoned me and offered incense to other gods to insult me by all their practices, and to kindle my wrath with this place, and it shall not be quenched. But to the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the ever-living, say this to him, Thus says the ever-living God of Israel about the words that you have heard. You opened a heart to consider them as from the ever-living, so that you may hear what I have spoken about this place and against its inhabitants, for it shall become desolate and despised. So you tore your robes and wept before me, and I have heard you also, says the ever-living. Therefore I will add you to your fathers, and you shall be added to your tomb in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the misery which I will bring upon this place." And they reported this answer to the king. Chapter 23. The king consequently sent and assembled to himself all the nobles of Judah and Jerusalem, when the king and all the representatives of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and preachers, and all the people from the lowest to the highest, went up to the house of the ever-living. And he read in their hearing all the contents of the book of laws that had been found in the house of the ever-living. Then the king mounted upon the platform, and made a declaration before the ever-living to walk after the ever-living, and to keep his commandments and his evidences and constitution, with all the heart and with all the soul, to establish the commands of the covenant written in that book, and the representatives of the people confirmed the declaration. The king also commanded Hilkiah the high priest, and the priests of the second rank, and the guards of the threshold, to bring out from the temple of the ever-living all the appliance they had made for Baal, and for Asherah, and for all the host of the skies, and to burn them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kedron, and carry their rubbish from the house of God. He also stopped the priest of the stars, whom the kings of Judah had appointed, who burned incense at the columns to Baal, and to the sun, and to the moon and the planets, and to all the army of the skies, and sent the shrines out of the house of the ever-living to the outside of Jerusalem, to the brook Kedron, and burnt them at the brook Kedron, and crushed their ashes, and flung the ashes on the graves of the followers of these people. He also pulled down the houses of prostitution which were in the house of the ever-living, where the women wove curtains for the shrines. Then he brought all the priests from the towns of Judah, and defiled the columns where the priests offered incense, from Gaba to Beersheba, and overturned the columns of the demons which had been erected at the gate by Joshua the governor of the city, on the left hand of each gate of the town. Nor did he permit those priests to sacrifice to the ever-living at the columns in Jerusalem, unless they ate biscuits among their brethren. He also defiled the furnace in the valley of the sons of Kinnon, where they passed their sons and daughters through the fire to Moloch, and destroyed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entry of the temple of the ever-living, near the chamber of Nathan-melech the eunuch, who was superintendent of the horses and the chariots of the sun, which he burnt with fire, and the altars also that were upon the embankment of the aqueduct of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made. And the king threw down the altars that Manasseh made in the two courts of the house of the ever-living, and powdered them, and threw their dust into the brook Kedron. The columns also which were opposite Jerusalem, on the right of the hill of consecration, which Solomon king of Israel built to Asheroth, and to Chemosh the abominations of Moab, and to Milcom the horror of the Ammonites, the king destroyed. And he broke the pillars, and cut down the groves, and filled their place with men's bones. The altar also that was in Bethel, which Jeroboam ben Nebat had built when he caused the sin of Israel, both that altar and the columns he threw down, and burnt the columns to fine dust, and burnt the shrines. But Josiah happened to turn and see the tombs which were on the hill. So he sent to take the bones from the tombs, and burnt them upon the altar, and defiled it, according to the message of the ever-living, which the man of God proclaimed when he foretold these events. He asked, "What is that monument I see?" And the people of the town replied to him, "The tomb of the man of God who came from Judah, and foretold these things that you are doing upon the altar of Bethel." When he answered, "Let his bones rest. No one shall touch his bones." So they preserved his bones, the bones of the preacher who came to Shomeron. Josiah, however, destroyed all the temples of columns that were in the villages of Shomeron, which the kings of Israel had constructed, as insults to the ever-living, and did to them as to all the fabrics they had erected in Bethel, and sacrificed all the priests of the columns who were there upon their altars, and burnt the bones of men upon them, then returned to Jerusalem. The king next commanded the people, saying, "Make a Passover to your ever-living God, such as is written in this book of laws." And they never made such a Passover in the times of the judges who judged Israel, and all the time of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, as this which was made in the 19th year of King Josiah, as they made at this Passover to the ever-living in Jerusalem. Because the spirit-raisers and soothsayers and theraphs and shakers existed in the country of Judah and in Jerusalem until the days of Josiah, but he conducted it by the instructions of the laws written in the book that had been found by Hilkiah the priest in the house of the ever-living. Such a king as he was had not been before him, who turned with all his heart and all his strength to the ever-living, in accordance with the whole law of Moses, and after him there did not arise another such. However, the ever-living did not turn from the great anger which consumed him against Judah on account of all the insults with which Manasseh had insulted him. The ever-living consequently said, "I will also turn away Judah from before my face, as I have turned Israel, and will waste this city of Jerusalem that I chose, and this house where I said my name shall be." As to the other affairs of Josiah, and all that he did, they are recorded in the history of events in the times of the kings of Judah. In his days, however, Pharaoh Necho, king of the Mitzrayim, advanced against the king of Ashur to the river Euphrates. And King Josiah went to meet him, but he killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. And his ministers carried him dead from Megiddo, and brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. Then the people of the country took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and consecrated him, and crowned him in the place of his father. Jehoahaz was 26 years old at his consecration, and reigned 3 months in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. But he did wrong in the sight of the ever-living in all that his ancestors had done. Pharaoh Necho, however, swept him away at Riblah in the district of Hamath from being king in Jerusalem, and laid a fine upon the country of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Pharaoh Necho also made Eliakim, son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, but changed his name to Jehoiakim, and took Jehoahaz and carried him to Mizar, and he died there. Jehoiakim paid the silver and gold to Pharaoh. He taxed the land to pay the money to Pharaoh. Every one of the people of the country had to provide the silver and the gold according to his valuation to pay to Pharaoh Necho. Jehoiakim was 25 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zebidah, the daughter of Phariah of Ramah. But he did evil in the sight of the ever-living in all that his ancestors had done. Chapter 24. In his time Nebuchadnezzar king of Babel advanced, and Jehoiakim was subject to him for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled from him. But the ever-living sent against him the troops of the Chassidim, and the troops of Aram, and the troops of Moab, and the troops of the Ammonites, whom he sent against Judah to destroy it, because it was the ever-living's intention against Judah to turn it from his presence for the sin of Manasseh in all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, filling Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the ever-living was not willing to forgive. As regards the other affairs of Jehoiakim, and all that he did, they are written in the history of events during the times of the kings of Judah. But Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin his son reigned after him. And the king of Egypt did not again come out from his country, for the king of Babel seized from the river of Egypt to the river Phrath, all of which had previously belonged to the king of Mizar. Jehoiakim was 19 years old at his coronation, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Nachshitha, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. He, however, did wrong in the sight of the ever-living in everything as his ancestors had done. At this period the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, advanced to Jerusalem and came to besiege the city. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, also came to the city while his officers were besieging it, when Jehoiakim capitulated to the king of Babel, himself, his mother, his ministers and generals, and eunuchs. Thus the king of Babel captured him in the 8th year of his reign. He also took away all the treasure from the house of the ever-living, and the treasures from the palace of the king, and collected the gold and furniture of gold that Solomon king of Israel had made for the temple of the ever-living, by the command of the ever-living, and transported all Jerusalem and all its nobles, and the whole of the officers of the army, 10,000, as captives, with all the carpenters and mechanics. He left none except the lower class of the country. He also transported Jehoiakim to Babel, with the king's mother and wives, and his eunuchs, together with the princes of the country, whom he carried captive from Jerusalem to Babel. Beside which the king of Babel made Mattaniah his uncle king in his place, but changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years of age at his coronation, and reigned 11 years at Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. But he did evil in the sight of the ever-living in everything that Jehoiakim had done, because the anger of the ever-living was against Jerusalem and Judah to throw them from his presence. Therefore Zedekiah revolted from the king of Babel. Chapter 25. In consequence, in the 9th year, on the 10th of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babel came with all his forces to Jerusalem and encamped against it, and they built a surrounding wall against it, and the siege of the city went on to the 11th year of King Zedekiah. At the 9th month the famine became terrible in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the country. So he burst from the city with a force of soldiers by night, by way of the wall which is towards the royal garden, although the Chassidim were around the city, and marched towards the desert. But the forces of the Chassidim pursued after the king, and overtook him at the fords of Jericho, with all his army, who scattered from him. They consequently seized the king, and carried him to the king of Babel at Riblath, and reported to him for a decision, when he killed the children of Zedekiah before his eyes, then pulled out the eyes of Zedekiah himself, and bound him in chains, and had him carried to Babel. Afterwards, in the 7th of the 5th month of the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar king of Babel, Nebuzaradan came with many slaughterers, servants of the king of Babel, to Jerusalem, and burnt the house of the ever-living, and the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every mansion was burnt with fire. Then all the army of the Chassidim, with the slaughterers, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, chief of the slaughterers, afterwards transported the remnant of the people of the city, with the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babel, and the rest of the great crowd. However, Nebuzaradan, chief of the slaughterers, left the lower classes as farmers and diggers. The Chassidim also broke up the pillars of brass that were at the house of the ever-living, and the bases, and the brazen sea which was in the ever-living's house, and carried the brass to Babel, with the pots, and the brushes, and sprinklers, and the tongs, and took all the appliances of brass which were made use of. The snuffers and scissors that were of gold for gold, and what were of silver for silver, the chief of the slaughterers took. And the 2 pillars, the single sea, and the pillars that Solomon made for the house of the ever-living were not weighed, for they were fabrics of brass. They were 18 cubits high, and stood each with its crown of brass, and the height of the crown was 3 cubits, with a network, and pomegranates around the crown. The whole of brass, and the 2nd pillar was like it, with its crown. The chief slaughterer also took Seraiah the chief priest, and Zephaniah the 2nd priest, and the commander of the guard of the threshold. And from the city he took a eunuch who was stationed over the war office, and 5 princes, attendants of the king, whom he found in the city, and the adjutant general of the army of the nation, with 16 from the parliament of the country, whom he found in the town. Nebuzaradan, chief of the slaughterers, took these and conducted them to the king of Babel at Riblath, where the king of Babel assailed and put them to death in Riblath, in the district of Chamath. Thus he transported Judah from its land. But for the remainder of the people in the land of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, appointed over them Gedaliah ben Achiakam ben Shaphan. But when the generals of the forces, they and the princes, heard that the king of Babel had appointed Gedaliah, they came to Gedaliah at Mitzvah, with Ishmael ben Nathan, and Jehonathan ben Karach, and Seraiah ben Tanchumeth the Netophite, and Jasniah ben Hamakathai, these and their men, when Gedaliah swore to them and their men, and said, "Fear nothing from the officers of the Chassidim who are stationed in the country, who serve the king of Babel," and bowed to them. However, in the 7th month, Ishmael ben Nathaniah ben Elishama of the royal family came, and 10 men with him, and assailed Gedaliah and killed him, and the Judeans and Chassidim who were with him at Mitzvah. Then all the people arose, from the least to the greatest, with the officers of the forces, and went to the Mitzrayim, for they were afraid of the Chassidim. In the 37th year from the transportation of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Avil-Merodach, king of Babel, in the year of his coronation, raised the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison, and spoke kindly to him, and gave him a seat above the seats of the other kings who were at Babel. He also removed his prison dress from him, and he ate his food continually in his presence all the time that he lived. And from thenceforward the king regularly supplied a daily allowance during his life. The end of chapters 21 through 25, and the end of the 2nd book of the Kings, from the Holy Bible in Modern English, translated by Farrar Fenton. Recording by Mark Penfold.